contrast leads to some, you ready? Okay, folks, we're going to start again. I had to answer the doctor when he called on the telephone. Now, we have this principle of contrast involving a tension, which tension is at some point, not necessarily at a dramatic point. It might be released over a period of observing, going back to look at an artwork or thinking about it. And then again, in some artworks, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you get a release between tensions that can be very satisfying. But that doesn't mean that you have to sit through the symphony several times to get the point. But then second, something that bothers me very much about the kind of art that we've had in the 20th century, which of course is varied in a way. You'd never know from reading Tom Wolfe that there were people doing landscape painting and people doing ordinary portraits and people doing pictures of West Texas in a drought and all sorts of artists working who weren't in the main line but would have been told that therefore they aren't artists. And you know what I think about that. So I'm going to make a second postulate in my aesthetics, that tension is about human beings and other creatures in this world, possibly. Now, and this, I'm trying to escape the clutches of something that we haven't talked about in class, but is very important in the history of philosophy, and that's called the Cartesian dualism. It stems from the writings of a French philosopher in the 17th century. His name was René Descartes. And Descartes held that the human mind is a pure thinking substance, and the human body is a geometrical machine. It is a different kind of substance entirely from thinking substance. They have nothing in common. Then he had a slight problem in figuring out how the two could ever relate to each other in any coherent way. I depend upon the health of my body for the health of my mind. I depend upon my body in order to be able to act. And whether I like it or not, I'm embodied. You do not see an embodied spirit giving you this lecture. You see Dr. Gunner, freckles and all. And that's just the way life is, and that's the way art is. So I make a second postulate, and that is that tensions involve human beings. But that's not innocent, because I look on human beings not as Descartes sometimes did. You'll excuse me while not as Descartes sometimes did, as disembodied spirits somehow haunting a physical body, but as actual people in the world, which incidentally was of course how Aristotle would have seen it. And that, I think, raises a host of problems, but it also, to me, raises a host of insights. There is some evidence that human beings are not the only creature on this planet that have some kind of aesthetic sense. One of my former philosophical colleagues, Charles Hartshorne, wrote a book called Born to Sing, in which he argues, because he was a world expert on birdsong, so that he could write that book. But he was convinced that some birds, at least those like the mockingbird, who vary their song or who can imitate all sorts of songs and sounds have a primitive aesthetic sense. The way that they repeat their song when they don't need to, and there's no ordinary biological reason why they should, indicates that they enjoy it. Well, let's assume that birds have some kind of awareness, which Descartes would have denied. You will find it very interesting to know, and it is part of your philosophical education, that Descartes believed that birds, bats, and your dog here, this is Wilhelm. You might pan over to Wilhelm. Does Wilhelm have no feelings? He acts as if he had several kinds of feelings, and I get a pleasure when you scratch my back, and Wilhelm gets pleasure. But Wilhelm, being a hound, is very sad because nobody is paying him enough attention. If you ever knew any hounds, there is no way you can pay enough attention to them. They feel sadness, and if I give him something really good to eat, he will walk around the house sort of grinning, showing you what he has. It's a matter of status, which is something that dogs have in packs. They have a degree of status. Do they have some kind of primitive aesthetic sense? Well, I know that Shelties do, but Wilhelm is unable to talk to me to tell me why. But we have elephants with which, when you give them a paintbrush and some paint, they will do paintings. That's kind of interesting, sort of bouncy, curvy paintings that they do. And then you have animals like the dolphin with its complex language. And it just seems as if there's an aesthetic component to that language. I'm not saying that dogs and cats and deer and elephants and whatever have aesthetic experience exactly as we do, but I think that they have it. But of course, if you were Descartes, you would say that all animals are simply complex machines, like deans and vice presidents. And so they have no thought or feeling. They're just machines. So it's been said that if Descartes had owned a poodle, that the whole of Western philosophy would have been different. But he didn't. And so what I want to do is root an aesthetics in the world. And of course that's problematic. Almost all the modernists would be likely to turn their back on that idea. They wanted some kind of, like Platonists, they wanted some kind of purity transcending the world. And as one of our students said in the last hour exam, that in some ways 20th century modernism was a war against nature. That is, if you want to talk about tensions and beauty, I think you have to talk about more than just people, but you must talk about people. And if you take the view that people are disembodied, like Descartes, then I'd say that you don't know much about human beings. The kind of bodies we have, the kind of sense organs we have, has a lot to do with the way we think. Suppose that like a bat or a dolphin, we were echolocators. We would see the world significantly different than human beings ordinarily do. Maybe the Impressionists were able to capture some of that. They were echolocating painters. Well, if we were a different biological creature, we would certainly be a different aesthetic creature. And I want to keep art from disappearing into abstractions. And then there's another reason for doing this. That is, there was a guy named Charles Darwin who came up with a very, for some people, unsettling picture of the human race. We are organisms that evolved on a planet. And as in that respect, we have that in common with all the other 2 billion plus organisms on this planet. If you do what, say, abstract art or conceptual art does, you really, and even abstract expressionism, you really end up with a grossly unnatural or anti-natural standpoint. Now, I'm not saying that art has to hold up the mirror to reality. Am I trying to bring back the concept of mimesis that governed Western art for centuries? Is art the imitation of nature? And the word nature seems to draw up pictures of the conventional. That is, nature is the flower pot with the flowers. Nature is the sleeping dog. Nature is the way the backyard looks when I go out to check on it after the rain. But I think one has a surprisingly conventional picture of nature, if that's what you mean by nature. If art were the imitation of nature, what is nature? And nature takes more forms and has more moods and is often different from what we expect. And so when you hold the mirror up to nature, what is it that you're holding the mirror up to? And I think that in dealing with mimesis, you need to think of mimesis as holding up the mirror to something which might be quite unusual and very strange. Does science hold up the mirror to nature? Does science tell you, sort of picture what's really there? We really believe that the earth goes around the sun, not that the sun goes around the earth. And we have a lot of evidence, overwhelming evidence for that. There's a car that runs around Denton 24 hours a day, and it has on it, "The earth is flat." Well, these are people from Lubbock. They've lived in a flat world. Well, anyhow. No, I don't think so. When I get a picture of the earth from orbit, it's round. And it makes every bit of sense to say that the earth goes around the sun. But when science holds up the mirror to nature, it comes up with all sorts of things that do not fit common sense. In quantum physics, when you use Heisenberg's uncertainty relations, you're unable to get the position and the momentum of a particle, assuming that it really is a particle, and you are unable to get the energy and time of a particle. Well, most of us don't think that the world is like that. That is, what I'm saying is science can give us pictures of the world that do not fit our common sense. Equally, some of the aesthetics I've been reading lately, people talk about the camera, which really put an end to realist painting. And in a sense it did, because it showed that a camera, not a human being, could get a better picture of what's out there. But that's not the whole truth, because I have worked with nature photographers. They're fascinating, because if the light isn't right, I mean, you go out with them to take photographs of nature, and if the light isn't what they want, they refuse to photograph. And if the time of day isn't right, they refuse to photograph. And if the weather isn't what they want, they refuse to photograph. And then maybe they'll want to do photography through some fine-grained lens, or with infrared film. That is, does a camera hold up a mirror to nature? Well, if it does, it's holding up dozens of different kinds of mirrors, much less the subject matter that a photographer would take. And I could give lots of examples of that from American photography, which I know better than photography from elsewhere, unfortunately. If you want to do nature photography, then what nature are you going to photograph? Are you going to photograph some animal killing and eating another? That's not edifying. But you might choose to make that what you're going to picture. So if you think that that by reducing or situating art in the human being or some other creature like it, in some respects, that you're bringing back mimesis as holding up a mirror to nature, well, that you might, but that's not necessarily what you would do. You might very well come up with a different picture of nature than anybody has imagined before. There's a stream in southeast Texas in the Big Thicket National Preserve called Pine Island Bayou. And it is the spookiest place I've ever been, and I've been to all sorts of nature places. And it's just this stream that barely meanders around. The water is almost black, and the trees around it are misshapen, and they're covered with Spanish moss. And in the bayou there are alligator gar, and there are alligators, and there are poisonous snakes, and there are water snakes, and there are strange birds. And you walk along that or try to wade in it, but you can't because of all the roots. You get a picture of nature that isn't what you think of as nature. And it's a challenge to human beings, including photographers, to seek nature out in its differentness. So what is Dr. Gunter saying? He said, at the center of his aesthetics, you would have tension, and then as a corollary of that tension in some living human being, and then they would be in the world. And I would say that art does itself no favors when it does a war against nature. So let me stop there. You can't, it can't be helped. You're going to have to listen to more about this later on. But let's talk a minute about the Vietnam War Memorial. There is a Korean War Memorial. There is the Lincoln Memorial. There is the Washington Monument. There are monuments to all kinds of wars and to famous people. And some might ask, well, are they art? But I think maybe a better question is, what do they do? What is the effect that's sought after in monuments and memorials? Now, a monument is a celebration. The Washington Monument is this obelisk that points upward and says, hurrah, America is a nation. But the Vietnamese War Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial, you think of Lincoln and the Civil War and the incredible toll of death and suffering that it brought. And then Lincoln was caught up in it. And he is sitting on this chair deeply reflecting, which was his character. There's a tension in either a memorial or a monument. A monument says hurrah, and it releases positive passions. A memorial is built so that usually those who died, will be remembered. The South put up statues to the Confederate soldier and Vietnam and the Civil War memorials everywhere. But almost without exception, they're not very happy. And for the South, of course, when you remember the Civil War, you do not remember a lot of happiness. If you lose, and the loss is the loss of your way of life, and your status and all kinds of things, then you feel you've really lost something. So that sets up a tension, which I think by provoking a kind of grief, maybe it's a kind of catharsis, but it's a kind of grief. And people grieve to get unhappiness out of their system. When someone in your family dies, there's going to be a lot of grief. But there must be a lot of grieving, or there's going to be mental illness. And the first thing that a psychiatrist will do is check back and find out that you are, instead of grieving, you're trying to bottle up your grief as if it didn't exist and go marching into the future happily. But you end up then having a lot of very neurotic, very unhealthy symptoms. And so you must go back to your grieving and work your way through grief. You say, well, that's terrible. Yeah, it is. But there's no simple way out of it. So in a way, all those memorials in the South helped relieve Southerners of a certain amount of grief, and to that extent, they were work of art. There was a tension of sadness and grief, and then there was an overcoming of it. But the Vietnam War Memorial, now, let kindly old grandfather Gunter tell you about the Vietnamese War. It happened before the lifetime of any of you. It continued, I'm trying to remember the exact dates. I think the first soldiers we sent to Vietnam were by John F. Kennedy in 1959, and the war ended in the early 1970s. But it was a war which we lost. And I remember us marching in there saying, we'll help our French friends and our Vietnamese friends, because Vietnam had been a French colony. And so we were helping those who had helped the French. And we kept putting more and more and more troops in, and more materiel at greater and greater cost. And though the military told us, and President Johnson told us, that we were winning, they had a constant drumbeat of onward to victory. We're showing them we're succeeding. And then body bag after body bag came back from Vietnam. And we watched the two things on television. Number one, we're winning. Number two, the body bags keep coming back in larger and larger numbers. And finally, it became clear, because of some dramatic things that happened, that we weren't winning. And that to win, we would have to bomb North Vietnam into the old Stone Age. We would have had to have killed, I don't know, we would have had to destroy almost everything there. And that seemed to be too much. So the end result was, with happiness for none, and then there was which coincided with the hippie revolt, or the countercultural revolt. I remember I was teaching at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I left about midsummer, and everybody was clothed like you and I are now, and everybody was sober or sober enough, except Saturday nights or whatever. And Knoxville, Tennessee, you may know, is a pretty conservative town. A liberal from Knoxville is like, I don't know what, you know. Uh, an impressionist painting drawn by an anthill. Well, that's a terrible example, but and when I got back at the end of the summer, suddenly Knoxville was a freak show, and all the students had their hair. How did they grow it that fast in the summer? You know, down to their shoulders or down to their hips, and they were walking around in almost nothing, or in something that you didn't particularly want to look at. They would get tie-dyed sheets and walk around in sheets. Or they would get these strange clothing that was in a multicolored and hung off the body like the rind on a potato. And they were standing on street corners, drinking, smoking marijuana. And that change and the Vietnam War came along together. And the end result was a massive anti-war movement that did a lot to change student life in the United States, maybe irreversibly. But the hippie culture remains with us, but I can't think of it except in terms of the Vietnamese War. So what am I saying? We lost that war, and the proof was, number one, the number of body bags that kept coming back more and more and more and more as we poured more men and materiel and jets and choppers and whatever else. And it was a bizarre, hellacious, weird war. A buddy of mine, Roy Hamrick, who was a photographer and a journalist, was there. He had his room was in a very plush hotel in the middle of Vietnam, and at night, or depending on when he was out on parole, he would leave the hotel in his fatigues, go out with his rifle and whatever else he had, his knife and his grenades and God knows what else, on patrol out in the Mekong Delta, where people would shoot at him and his buddies would get killed, and he was just lucky to survive. And then he'd go back to the hotel and have a drink and watch television, and then he'd go out and he'd go walk in through the jungles and be shot at by the Vietnamese and shoot at them. His job was to kill them, their job was to kill him. I've had many friends who came out of the Vietnamese War, and another thing that came out of it, besides the hippie revolt, which would have been I don't know what, but it became a revolt, and that was the number of people who came back mentally ill from that war. I mean, you would walk along and suddenly you'd have a spike through your foot that the Vietnamese had set out for you. Or you'd walk along and you'd find some village where everybody had been slaughtered. Or you'd walk along, or you'd be riding in a helicopter with 40 other guys, and the Vietnamese would knock it down with a rocket, and then you'd be on the ground with your dying buddies. And maybe you'd survive and you'd feel guilt because you survived and they didn't. It's called survivor's guilt. I'm saying that the cost of that war, in terms of money, but in terms of lives, but in terms of people's psychological lives, very great. And the number of anti-war demonstrations, you had them in Denton, you had them in Dallas, you had them in Fort Worth, you have it in every American town. At the very end, some of the American generals thought we had arrived at victory, but the American people had simply had enough of it. And so what we did was start withdrawing troops from Vietnam. And when the last of our troops left, along with some Vietnamese people who would have been killed if they'd remained there, in the next house back of my house here in Denton, there's a couple that came from Vietnam after the Vietnamese War to save their lives. They didn't know they'd be living in America, but it was better than the alternative, which was death. So this was a horrendous war, and we finally simply withdrew. And then we withdrew our support of the South Korean, our financial support, and the South Korean government collapsed. So now how do you deal with that? It's in a way, it's one of those wars, people don't remember the Korean War. It's called the Forgotten War. Will we remember our fighting against Iraq? In effect, we fought 2 wars against them. I think not so much, and I don't think we'll remember the Korean War and the Spanish-American War, and some wars tend to fall into the background. But the Vietnamese War was such a tumult in American society, it was almost like a civil war, except that we weren't shooting at each other. Now, how do you respond to that? What I feared is that somebody would build some heroic statue trying to make it look as if we had won that war. But anyone who lived through all that, and incidentally I finally came out against it, it wasn't easy for me to do, but came out against it and was chairman of the East Tennessee Volunteers for Peace in Knoxville, of all places to be. That made you a liberal, no matter what you were. And it was mainly a youth revolt there in Knoxville. And so I look back on it, and what can I make of this war? And the Vietnam Memorial is a very quiet, it's very effective because it is understated. There's nothing towering. There's nothing that rises above the landscape. It's a kind of V, and when you get down to the end of the V, it's about 10 feet below ground level. And as you walk back out, you get up to ground level. And so this slopes down, and you walk down, and as you slope down, the walls get higher and higher. The walls are black, polished black. I said granite, I may have to regret that, doesn't matter. Polished black stone. Not a bit of red, white, and blue anywhere. If there's anything that isn't Technicolor, it's the Vietnamese War Memorial. And you walk down to the end, and what do you see on either side of you? There's no statues, there's no obelisks, there's no Greek pillars. There's simply this wall, and on this wall is all the names of all the people who died or were lost in action in that war. They're very beautifully, tastefully carved, and they go from the beginning of the war to the end chronologically. And 52,000 names on those walls, each a person. And you cannot walk down into that memorial. First place, the sense you get of things is not defeat exactly, but it's sadness. It's terrible sadness. Maybe it's grief, but it's certainly sadness. And what else could you possibly feel if you pay attention? Now, you can walk into it and walk out of it and not care, but if you focus your attention on it, then here's the dead, simply the dead, thousands and thousands, and you realize each was a person. Each had a beginning, a middle, and a surname. The only contrast to this, so many Americans didn't like that. And incidentally, the Vietnamese War Memorial was paid for by donations. Uncle Sam didn't have to pay a nickel, so the conservatives couldn't complain. But the feeling of sadness at what has been lost and the cost in people, I think no one says anything about it. If there was somebody up there making speeches, you'd turn around and walk out. But what you have then is someone who walks through this memorial, and you just keep looking at these names: Irish, Italian, Scottish, Arabic, Japanese, but all these names of all these 52,000 people. And extremely impressive. Extremely impressive. But where is the contrast? What is the tension? Well, the contrast, I think, is between the memorial and its physical context. Here you have a sort of pleasant park-like area where people go to sit and walk the dog and take their kids and maybe play frisbees or whatever you do in an area. So all this ordinary life, and suddenly you're walking down this slowly deepening triangle, and you're at the vertex, and you've seen name after name. So the contrast, first of all, is between the memorial and the happy park-like world surrounding it. And what makes it, I think, so impressive is that it is something the English are supposed to be very good at. That is understatement. There aren't any, I don't think there's any music playing. I don't remember it. And there aren't any people making speeches. And there aren't any flags. The only break in this is that some people who just said, this is too negative. I can't stand this. It's too abstract. And you could say that this is abstract art, but it's in that you have all these personal names. That isn't abstract. That's very concrete. And then one part of it points towards the Washington Monument, and another points towards the Lincoln Memorial. So this thing is historically framed. It's not, you might call it semi-abstract art if you had to grope for a word. But it's certainly in the world. It's in the soil and the subsoil of Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And it is in this historic triangle with the Lincoln Monument and the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial being pointed to, so that this triangular shaped artwork embeds itself in history. What difference does that make? Well, if you don't know it, it won't make any difference. But if you do, then you've got these two very different pictures of war, and you have to think about it, but in thinking about it, you feel it. I mean, you can do all kinds of thinking with very little feeling content at all. But I found it impossible. I was pretty deeply struck by that memorial. And then there's one further thing. The people who complained about it being just too abstract, so they put a statue of 3 soldiers, GIs, in full battle gear, and they're as if they were suddenly being shot at and they were trying to look for a place to hide or trying to get a grasp of where they are. So I forget, they're ethnically, each one is different. And one is African American, one is freckled American, and then the other I think is Asiatic. And I think that's very good because it points out that the Japanese and the Chinese and the Vietnamese in this country fought in our army in that war. But again, the whole thing is understated. And I think the understatement is what gives it its power. At any rate, I find that if I'm in Washington and have some time, I go look at that memorial, and I advise you to do so. Why is it so powerful? Incidentally, let me see if I've got that. I wrote it all out. What did I do with it? Well, it was done by let's see, her name was Maya Ying Lin. She was 21-year-old art student and won a competition to have her version of the memorial put into Washington, D.C. So I think it's just kind of nice that an Asiatic had done this memorial. It is, incidentally, 140 feet long from the ground level as you walk down into it, 140 feet. Black walls, all these names, and then that's it. You know, once you've stated, you don't have to keep adding to it. And I think that this picture of this realist statue of soldiers, I think by itself it wouldn't have been anything. But in context, once again, it shows you these were not statistics. Joseph Stalin once said, and it tells you a lot about him, the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of 10,000 is a statistic. What did he mean? If there's so many that they're just many, you can't feel anything about it. But here, these are the names, and beautifully carved, and very clear, and a shining black background, and so you're moved. And so it is a very neat piece of art, and it fits Dr. Gunter's aesthetics. And since it fits Dr. Gunter's aesthetics, I'm going to draw a halt to this lecture. Let me give you again what your assignments are and explain again about the second hour exam and the final. Okay, in the next lecture, which we will tape tomorrow, we talk about Plato. He's on page 181 to 195 in Aesthetics. Okay, the big questions. Then, why no women artists, which is 314 to 323, and then gender and genius. I didn't want to give an aesthetics course without taking up the feminist point of view. I think there's a lot in it, and I've got personal examples. It has been harder, much harder, for women to make a career in painting or sculpture than it has been for men. And what does that mean? Well, if you pursue it deeply enough, it gets into fundamental aesthetic questions. Do women feel the world differently from men or not? I think in some respects they do. But I don't fully understand it, folks. Like most men, women will tell you, I don't understand a damn thing going on. You need a woman to explain it to you. But even so, thought, feeling, intelligence, talent, genius, and the extreme difficulty that women have had in trying to get beyond the limitations that often completely unknowingly the culture imposes. So then you've got all these hippies and liberals and bad people who keep telling women they don't have to be second-class citizens or something, and then you see the horrible world that this leads to. Next thing you know, some woman's going to try to run for president. God help us, I got. So you are now free. You've had about as much nonsense as you can bear for one day, and as I can say. So I will let you go, and then tomorrow we'll talk about Plato, not Play-Doh, Plato. Got it? See you in the next lecture.